We're going to continue our exploration of Chapter 9, which is titled Professional Ethics. And in particular, we're going to explore Section 9.3 and Section 9.4. Section 9.3 is titled Software Engineering Code of Ethics, and the Software Engineering Code of Ethics and Professional Practice is a practical framework for moral decision-making related to problems that software engineers may encounter. And we're going to start off with a preamble of the code. So, as we know, computers have a central and growing role in commerce, industry, government, medicine, education, entertainment, and society at large. And software engineers are those who contribute by direct participation or by teaching to the analysis, specification, design, development, certification, maintenance, and testing of software systems. And because of their roles in developing software systems, software engineers have significant opportunities to do good or cause harm, or to enable others to do good or cause harm, or to influence others to do good or cause harm. So to ensure as much as humanly possible that their efforts will be used for good, software engineers must commit themselves to making software engineering a beneficial and respected profession. So in accordance with that commitment, software engineers shall adhere to the following code of ethics and professional practice. The code contains 8 principles related to the behavior of and decisions made by professional software engineers, including practitioners, educators, managers, supervisors, and policymakers, as well as trainees and students of the profession. And these 8 principles identify the ethically responsible relationships in which individuals, groups, and organizations participate, and the primary obligations within these relationships. And then there are clauses of each principle, several in fact, and they are illustrations of some of the obligations included in these relationships. These obligations are founded in the software engineer's humanity, in the special care owed to people affected by the work of software engineers, and the unique elements of the practice of software engineering. The code prescribes these principles as obligations of anyone claiming to be or aspiring to be a software engineer. So these 8 principles are not intended for the individual, or the individual parts of the code are not intended to be used in isolation to justify errors of omission or commission. And the list of principles and clauses is not necessarily exhaustive. So the clauses should not be read as separating the acceptable from the unacceptable in professional conduct in all practical situations. And the code is not a simple ethical algorithm that generates ethical decisions in a step-by-step manner. Doesn't provide a decision procedure, in other words, to solve any ethical problem. So in some situations, standards may be in tension with each other or with standards from other sources, in fact. And then in these situations, it will require that the software engineer use ethical judgment to act in a manner which is most consistent with the spirit of the code of ethics and professional practice given the particular circumstances. And so ethical tensions like these can best be addressed by thoughtful consideration of fundamental principles, and that's where we have to hark back to the normative systems of ethics and the fundamental moral principles or concepts in them, rather than blind reliance on detailed regulations. And these principles should influence software engineers to consider broadly who is affected by their work, and to examine if they and their colleagues are treating other human beings with due respect, and to consider how the public, if the public was reasonably well informed, would view their decisions, and to analyze how the least empowered will be affected by their decisions, and to consider whether their acts would be judged worthy of the ideal professional working as a software engineer. In all these judgments, concern for the health, safety, and welfare of the public is primary. That is, the public interest is foundational to this code. All right, so there are 8 principles that are used to identify morally responsible relationships in this code. And so here are the 8 principles involved: the public, the client and employer, the product, judgment, management, profession, colleagues, and self. So we'll go through each of these 8 principles and their clauses now. All right, so the first principle says that software engineers shall act consistently with the public interest. And then this is broken down into particulars with these following clauses. So clause 1.01 says that software engineers shall accept full responsibility for their own work. And clause 1.02 says that software engineers shall moderate the interests of the software engineer, the employer, the client, and the users with the public good. Clause 1.03 says that the software engineer shall approve software only if they have a well-founded belief that it is safe, meets specifications, passes appropriate tests, and does not diminish quality of life or diminish privacy or harm the environment. And the ultimate effect of the work should be to the public good. Clause 1.04 says that the software engineer shall disclose to appropriate persons or authorities any actual or potential danger to the user or the public or the environment that they reasonably believe to be associated with software or related documents. Clause 1.05 says that the software engineer shall cooperate in efforts to address matters of grave public concern caused by software or its installation or maintenance or support or documentation. And clause 1.06 says that the software engineer shall be fair and avoid deception in all statements, particularly public ones, concerning software or related documents, methods, and tools. And clause 1.07 says that the software engineer shall consider issues of physical disabilities, allocation of resources, economic disadvantage, and other factors that can diminish access to the benefits of software. And finally, clause 1.08 of this first principle says that the software engineer shall be encouraged to volunteer professional skills to good causes and contribute to public education concerning the discipline. All right, so now on to our second principle, which says that the software engineers shall act in a manner that is in the best interests of their client and employer, so long as it's consistent with the public interest. And there are various clauses here. So clause 2.01 says that software engineers shall provide service in their areas of competence, being honest and forthright about any limitations of their experience and education. Clause 2.02 says that software engineers shall not knowingly use software that is obtained or retained either illegally or unethically. Clause 2.03 says that software engineers shall use the property of a client or employer only in ways properly authorized and with the client's or employer's knowledge and consent. Clause 2.04 says that software engineers shall ensure that any document upon which they rely has been approved when required by someone authorized to approve it. Clause 2.05 says that software engineers shall keep private any confidential information gained in their professional work where such confidentiality is consistent with the public interest and consistent with the law. Clause 2.06 says that software engineers shall identify, document, collect evidence, and report to the client or the employer promptly if, in their opinion, a project is likely to fail, to prove too expensive, or to violate intellectual property law, or otherwise be problematic. Clause 2.07 says that the software engineer shall identify, document, and report significant issues of social concern of which they are aware in software or related documents to the employer or the client. And clause 2.08 says that the software engineer shall accept no outside work detrimental to the work they perform for their primary employer. And finally, clause 2.09 says that the software engineer shall promote no interests adverse to their employer or client unless a higher ethical concern is being compromised. And in that case, they shall inform the employer or another appropriate authority of the ethical concern. Okay, and then the third principle says that software engineers shall ensure that their products and related modifications meet the highest professional standards possible. And the clauses here spell that out in some detail. So clause 3.01 says that software engineers shall strive for high quality, accessible cost, and a reasonable schedule, ensuring significant trade-offs are clear to and accepted by the employer and the client and are available for consideration by the user and the public. And clause 3.02 says that software engineers shall ensure proper and achievable goals and objectives for any project on which they work or propose. Clause 3.03 says that software engineers shall identify, define, and address ethical, economic, cultural, legal, and environmental issues related to work projects. Clause 3.04 says that software engineers shall ensure that they are qualified for any project on which they work or propose to work by an appropriate combination of education and training and experience. And clause 3.05 says that software engineers shall ensure an appropriate method is used for any project on which they work or propose to work. And clause 3.06 says that software engineers shall work to follow professional standards when available that are most appropriate for the task at hand, departing from these only when ethically or technically justified. And clause 3.07 says that software engineers shall strive to fully understand the specifications for software on which they work. And clause 3.08 says that software engineers shall ensure that specifications for software on which they work have been well documented and satisfy the user's requirements and have the appropriate approvals. Right, and there are further clauses for Principle 3. So clause 3.09 says that software engineers shall ensure realistic quantitative estimates of cost, scheduling, personnel, quality, and outcomes on any project on which they work or propose to work, and provide an uncertainty assessment of these estimates. Clause 3.10 says that software engineers shall ensure adequate testing, debugging, and review of software and related documents is completed on which they work. And clause 3.11 says that software engineers shall ensure adequate documentation, including significant problems discovered and solutions adopted for any project on which they work. And clause 3.12 says that software engineers shall work to develop software and related documents that respect the privacy of those who will be affected by that software. And clause 3.13 says that software engineers shall be careful to use only accurate data derived by ethical and lawful means and use it only in ways properly authorized. Clause 3.14 says that software engineers shall maintain the integrity of data, being sensitive to outdated or flawed occurrences. And clause 3.15 says that software engineers shall treat all forms of software maintenance with the same professionalism as new development. Okay, so much for the third principle. Now we can cover the fourth principle, which says that software engineers shall maintain integrity and independence in their professional judgment. And there are 6 further clauses that flesh out this fourth principle. So clause 4.01 says that software engineers shall temper all technical judgments by the need to support and maintain human values. And clause 4.02 says that software engineers shall only endorse documents either prepared under their supervision or within their areas of competence and with which they are in agreement. And clause 4.03 says that software engineers shall maintain professional objectivity with respect to any software or related documents they are asked to evaluate. And clause 4.04 says that software engineers shall not engage in deceptive financial practices such as bribery, double billing, or other improper financial practices. And clause 4.05 says that software engineers shall disclose to all concerned parties those conflicts of interest that cannot reasonably be avoided or escaped. And then the final clause of Principle 4 is clause 4.06, which says that software engineers shall refuse to participate as members or advisors in a private, governmental, or professional body concerned with software-related issues in which they, their employers, or their clients have undisclosed potential conflicts of interest. All right, the fifth principle says that software engineering managers and leaders shall subscribe to and promote an ethical approach to the management of software development and maintenance. And in particular, there are these further clauses fleshing out the fifth principle. So clause 5.01 says that software engineering managers and leaders shall ensure good management for any project on which they work, including effective procedures for promotion of quality and reduction of risk. And clause 5.02 says that software engineering managers and leaders shall ensure that software engineers are informed of standards before being held to them. Clause 5.03 says that software engineer managers and leaders shall ensure that software engineers know the employer's policies and procedures for protecting passwords, files, and information that is confidential to the employer or confidential to others. And clause 5.04 says that software engineering managers and leaders shall assign work only after taking into account appropriate contributions of education and experience, tempered with a desire to further that education and experience. And clause 5.05 says that software engineering managers and leaders shall ensure realistic quantitative estimates of cost, scheduling, personnel, quality, and outcomes on any project on which they work or propose to work, and provide an uncertainty assessment of these estimates. Clause 5.06 says that software engineering managers and leaders shall attract potential software engineers only by a full and accurate description of the conditions of employment. And clause 5.07 says that software engineering managers and leaders shall offer fair and just remuneration. Clause 5.08 says that software engineering managers and leaders shall not unjustly prevent someone from taking a position for which that person is suitably qualified. Clause 5.09 says that software engineering managers and leaders shall ensure that there is a fair agreement concerning ownership of any software, processes, research, writing, or other intellectual property to which a software engineer has contributed. Clause 5.10 says that software engineering managers and leaders shall provide for due process in hearing charges of violation of an employer's policy or of this code. Clause 5.11 says that software engineering managers and leaders shall not ask a software engineer to do anything inconsistent with this code. And clause 5.12 says that software engineering managers and leaders shall not punish anyone for expressing ethical concerns about a project. Okay, the sixth principle here says that software engineers shall advance the integrity and reputation of the profession consistent with the public interest. All right, and there are further clauses to flesh out this sixth principle. So according to clause 6.01, software engineers shall help develop an organizational environment favorable to acting ethically. And clause 6.02 says that software engineers shall promote public knowledge of software engineering. Clause 6.03 says that software engineers shall extend software engineering knowledge by appropriate participation in professional organizations, meetings, and publications. Clause 6.04 says that software engineers shall support, as members of a profession, other software engineers striving to follow this code. Clause 6.05 says that software engineers shall not promote their own interest at the expense of the profession, client, or employer. Clause 6.06 says that software engineers shall obey all laws governing their work unless, in exceptional circumstances, such compliance is inconsistent with the public interest. Clause 6.07 says that software engineers shall be accurate in stating the characteristics of software on which they work, avoiding not only false claims, but also claims that might reasonably be supposed to be speculative, vacuous, deceptive, misleading, or doubtful. All right, and these are the final clauses of Principle 6. So Clause 6.08 says that software engineers shall take responsibility for detecting, correcting, and reporting errors in software and associated documents on which they work. Clause 6.09 says that software engineers shall ensure that clients, employers, and supervisors know of the software engineer's commitment to this code of ethics and the subsequent ramifications of such commitment. Clause 6.10 says that software engineers shall avoid associations with businesses and organizations which are in conflict with this code. Clause 6.11 says that software engineers shall recognize that violations of this code are inconsistent with being a professional software engineer. Clause 6.12 says that software engineers shall express concerns to the people involved when significant violations of this code are detected, unless this is impossible, counterproductive, or dangerous. And finally, Clause 6.13 says that software engineers shall report significant violations of this code to appropriate authorities when it is clear that consultation with people involved in these significant violations is impossible, counterproductive, or dangerous. Okay, the seventh principle says that software engineers shall be fair to and supportive of their colleagues. And there are further clauses fleshing out this seventh principle. So according to clause 7.01, software engineers shall encourage colleagues to adhere to this code. According to clause 7.02, software engineers shall assist colleagues in professional development. Clause 7.03 says that software engineers shall credit fully the work of others and refrain from taking undue credit. Clause 7.04 says that software engineers shall review the work of others in an objective, candid, and properly documented way. Clause 7.05 says that software engineers shall give a fair hearing to the opinions, concerns, or complaints of a colleague. And clause 7.06 says that software engineers shall assist colleagues in being fully aware of current standard work practices, including policies and procedures for protecting passwords, files, and other confidential information, and security measures in general. Section 7.07 says that software engineers shall not unfairly intervene in the career of any colleague. However, concern for the employer, the client, or public interest may compel software engineers in good faith to question the competence of a colleague. And clause 7.08 says that software engineers shall, in situations outside of their own areas of competence, call upon the opinions of other professionals who have competence in that area. Okay, and this is the eighth and final principle of the code, and it says that software engineers shall participate in lifelong learning regarding the practice of their profession and shall promote an ethical approach to the practice of the profession. And the clauses that flesh this out total up to be 9 further clauses. And so according to clause 8.01, software engineers shall further their knowledge of developments in the analysis, specification, design, development, maintenance, and testing of software and related documents, together with the management of the development process. And clause 8.02 says that software engineers shall improve their ability to create safe, reliable, and useful quality software at reasonable cost and within a reasonable time. Clause 8.03 says that software engineers shall improve their ability to produce accurate, informative, and well-written documentation. Clause 8.04 says that software engineers shall improve their understanding of the software and related documents on which they work, and of the environment in which they will be used. Clause 8.05 says that software engineers shall improve their knowledge of relevant standards and the law governing the software and related documents on which they work. Clause 8.06 says that software engineers shall improve their knowledge of this code, its interpretation, and its application to their work. And clause 8.07 says that software engineers shall not give unfair treatment to anyone because of any irrelevant prejudices. Clause 8.08 says that software engineers shall not influence others to undertake any action that involves a breach of this code. And clause 8.09 says that software engineers shall recognize that personal violations of this code are inconsistent with being a professional software engineer. All right, section 9.4 is titled Analysis of the Code. So in this section, we'll analyze the Software Engineering Code of Ethics and professional practice and derive an alternate set of underlying principles upon which this code of ethics seems to rest. So we'll do analysis preamble here. So the preamble to the code points out that there is no mechanical process, as we stated already, for determining the correct actions to take when faced with a moral problem. Our experience evaluating moral problems related to the introduction and use of information technology has confirmed this statement. For example, even two people with similar philosophies may reach different conclusions when confronted with a moral problem. Two Kantian deontologists, let's say, may agree on the basic facts of a moral problem, but disagree on how to characterize the will of the moral agent. Or again, two utilitarians may agree on the benefits and harms resulting from a proposed action, but assign different weights to the outcomes, which would cause them to reach opposite conclusions. The preamble also warns against taking an overly legalistic view of the code, so it's not like a wholly inspired text. So simply because an action is not expressly forbidden by the code does not mean it is morally acceptable, right? The code is not exhaustive. Instead, judgment is needed to detect when a moral problem has arisen and to determine the right thing to do in a particular situation. So while the code is expressed as a collection of rules, these rules are based on principles grounded in different normative systems of ethics. And this is not surprising considering that the code was drafted by a committee. And when we encounter a situation where two rules conflict, the preamble urges us to ask questions that will help us consider the principles underlying the rules. And these questions help to demonstrate the multifaceted grounding of the code. So here's a series of questions that are helpful to ask when there's disagreement or conflicting rules being applied to a particular situation. So first question you can ask is, who is affected? And utilitarians will focus on determining how an action benefits or harms other people. Second helpful question is, am I treating other human beings with respect? And so Kant's second categorical imperative tells us to treat others as ends and ourselves as ends in themselves rather than simply as a means to an end. A third helpful question to consider is, would my decision hold up to public scrutiny? So in other words, does the action reflect well on my character? Developing a good character, as we know, is central to virtue ethics. Fourth question that can be helpful to ask is, how will those who are least empowered be affected? We know that Rawls's second principle of justice requires us to consider whether inequalities are to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. And then a fifth helpful question is, are my acts worthy of the ideal professional? And here this is alluding to virtue ethics, which is based on the imitation of morally superior role models. Okay, so here is an alternative discipline-independent list of fundamental moral principles that seem to lie beneath or are fundamental to the code of ethics. So here, the first fundamental moral principle is to be impartial. The good of the general public is equally important as the good of your organization or company, so we need to be impartial. And the good of your profession and your company are equally important to your personal good. And it is wrong to promote your agenda at the expense of your firm, and it is wrong to promote the interests of your firm at the expense of society, according to this fundamental moral principle that says we ought to be impartial. Okay, second fundamental moral principle is to disclose information that others ought to know. So do not let others come to harm by concealing information from them. You should not make misleading or deceptive statements, and you should disclose potential conflicts of interest. And this fundamental moral principle is supported by several clauses, just like the one to be impartial is, right? So, these fundamental moral rules support the clauses. So clauses 1.04, 1.06, 2.06, 2.07, 3.01, several clauses from the fourth, fifth, sixth, and sixth principle are supported by this fundamental moral principle that we should disclose information that others ought to know. And then being impartial supports clauses 1.02, 1.03, 1.05, 1.07, some clauses from Principle 3, 4.01, and 6.05. And so this will be true of all the fundamental moral principles that follow. So the third fundamental moral principle is to respect the rights of others. And this means that we do not infringe on the privacy rights, property rights, or intellectual property rights of others. And this will support clauses 2.02, 2.03, 2.05, and 3.13. A fourth fundamental moral principle is to treat others justly. And what this means is everyone deserves fair wages and appropriate credit for work performed. You should not discriminate against others for attributes unrelated to the job they do, and you should not penalize others for following the code itself. And this will support several clauses from the Code of Ethics, from Principles 5, 7, and one clause from Principle 8, Clause 8.07. The fifth fundamental moral principle underlying the code seems to be that we should take responsibility for our actions and inactions. So what that means is, as a moral agent, you are morally responsible for the things you do, because you can respond to moral reasons or base your actions, your moral actions at least, on moral reasons. Those reasons can guide your actions. So you're responsible then for both the good things you do and the bad things, for the morally right things and the morally wrong things. And you may also be responsible for morally wrong things that you allow to happen through your inaction. And so this fifth fundamental moral principle will support clause 1.01 and several clauses from Principle 3 and clause 4.02 and clause 7.08. And a sixth fundamental moral principle is that we should take responsibility for the actions of those that you supervise, if you are supervising anybody. So this means is that managers are responsible for setting up work assignments and training opportunities to promote quality and reduce risk. So managers should create effective communication channels with subordinates so that they can monitor the work being done and be aware of any quality or risk issues that arise. And this sixth fundamental moral principle will support several clauses from the fifth principle. Let's see, a seventh fundamental moral principle is to maintain your integrity. So what this means is that you should deliver on your commitments and be loyal to your employer while obeying the law, and that you should not ask someone else to do something you would not be willing to do yourself. All right, and the seventh fundamental moral principle supports several clauses from Principle 2, Principle 3, Principle 4, Principle 6, and Principle 8. An eighth fundamental moral principle is to continually improve your abilities. And what this means is to take advantage of opportunities to improve your software engineering skills and your ability to put the code to use. And this eighth fundamental moral principle would support several clauses from Principle 8. And a final fundamental moral principle, number 9 in our list here, is that you should share your knowledge, expertise, and values. What this means is that you should volunteer your time and skills to worthy causes. You should help bring others to your level of knowledge about software engineering and professional ethics. All right, and this ninth fundamental moral principle would support clause 1.08 and several clauses from Principle 6 and Principle 7.